often helped my elderly neighbor with household chores. But after what I found in her attic, I almost ended up in prison. Yeah, I know how that sounds, but stick with me here because this story gets absolutely wild. So there I was, your typical 20-something guy living in suburban Ohio, working part-time at Best Buy and trying to figure out what to do with my life. You know the drill. Still living at home. Parents constantly asking when I'm going to get a real job. The whole American dream thing feeling more like a fever dream. But there was this one thing I did that actually made me feel good about myself. Mrs. Edna lived right across the street in this little blue house that had seen better days. Must have been in her 80s, maybe older, and she was completely alone. I'm talking nobody visits her, ever kind of alone. Her mailbox was always overflowing. Her yard was slowly turning into a jungle, and sometimes I'd see her through the window just sitting there, staring out at nothing. Most people in the neighborhood just ignored her. You know how it is. Everybody's got their own problems, their own lives to deal with, but something about her situation just ate at me. Maybe it was because my grandmother had passed away the year before, and I kept thinking about how she would have hated being forgotten like that. So I started small, picked up her mail when I got mine, mowed her lawn when I did ours, shoveled her driveway in winter. Nothing crazy, just basic human decency stuff. But man, you should have seen the looks I got from my parents. My mom was the worst about it. Every time she saw me heading over there with the leaf blower or whatever, she'd give me this look like I was completely insane. One day, she finally couldn't hold it back anymore and just laid into me about how I was wasting my time on some old lady who probably wouldn't even remember my name tomorrow. My dad was more practical about his disapproval. He kept going on about how I should be focusing on my career, networking with people my own age, building connections that might actually help me get ahead in life. The whole pulling yourself up by your bootstrap speech that every American dad seems to have memorized. But here's the thing. I wasn't doing it for any of those reasons. I wasn't expecting anything in return. I wasn't playing some long game hoping she'd mention me in her will. I just genuinely felt bad for her, and helping out made me feel like maybe I wasn't completely useless after all. Mrs. Edna was always so grateful, too, not in an over-the-top way. But you could tell it meant everything to her. She'd wave from her window when I was out there working, and sometimes she'd leave a plate of cookies on my doorstep. Nothing fancy, just those generic store-bought ones. But the gesture was what mattered. The neighbors thought I was nuts, of course. I'd be out there raking leaves or whatever, and I could see them peeking through their curtains, probably wondering what angle I was working. Because that's how we think, right? Nobody does anything nice without wanting something in return. It's sad, but that's the world we live in. I remember one time I was helping her bring in groceries. She'd taken an Uber to the store, which must have cost her a fortune, and Mr. Peterson from next door made some comment about how I must really be playing the long game. Like, what kind of twisted worldview do you have to think that way? But I kept helping her anyway. Partly because I genuinely cared about her, and partly because my parents' attitude about it just made me more determined to prove them wrong. You know how it is when you're young. Sometimes you do the right thing just despite the people telling you not to. Then one day, everything changed. It was a Tuesday in late September, and I was over there fixing her front porch light when she came outside, looking more serious than usual. She had this way of moving that made you realize just how old she really was. Like every step was calculated, like she was conserving energy for something important. She asked me if I had a few minutes to talk, and we sat down on her porch swing. The thing creaked like it was about to fall apart, but it held our weight. She told me she'd been thinking about moving to one of those assisted living places, that she was tired of struggling to keep up with everything. I tried to talk her out of it at first, offered to help her more, but she had this look in her eyes like she'd already made up her mind. She said she just wanted to get everything in order before she left, and that included cleaning out her attic. Now, I'd been in that house plenty of times, but I'd never been upstairs. The attic was one of those pull-down ladder deals, and she obviously couldn't manage it herself anymore. She asked if I'd be willing to help her go through everything up there, maybe help her decide what to keep and what to throw away. I said yes immediately. Of course, I mean, what else was I going to do? But I could already hear my parents' voices in my head. telling me I was wasting my time again, that I should be focusing on my own life instead of playing house with some old lady. When I got home that night and told them about it, they absolutely lost their minds. My mom went off about how I was being taken advantage of, how Mrs. Edna was probably just using me for free labor. My dad chimed in with his usual lecture about opportunity cost and how I could be using that time to build my resume or whatever. But the worst part was when my mom said I was being naive, that old people like Mrs. Edna were always looking for young suckers to manipulate. She said I was probably just making myself feel important by playing hero to someone who didn't even really need my help. That comment hit me harder than it should have, because part of me wondered if maybe she was right. Maybe I was just trying to make myself feel better about my own pathetic life by swooping in to save someone else. Maybe the whole thing was just some weird savior complex. But then I thought about how Mrs. Edna looked when she asked for help. Not manipulative, not scheming, just tired and sad and alone. And I realized that even if my parents were right about my motivations, it didn't change the fact that she needed help and I was in a position to give it. So the next morning, I went over there with my work gloves and a bunch of garbage bags, ready to spend the day sorting through decades of accumulated stuff. Mrs. Edna made us some coffee, the kind that's so strong it could wake the dead, and we headed upstairs. The attic was exactly what you'd expect from an 80-year-old woman who'd lived in the same house for 50 years. Boxes everywhere, old furniture covered in sheets, photo albums stacked 3 feet high. The air was thick with dust and that particular smell that old houses have, like mothballs and memories. We started with the obvious junk, broken lamps, clothes that hadn't been worn since the Carter administration, boxes of Christmas decorations that had seen better days. Mrs. Edna was surprisingly ruthless about throwing things away. I think she'd reached that point in life where you realize most of the stuff you've been holding on to doesn't actually matter. But then we got to the more personal stuff, and that's where things got interesting. Photo albums full of people she couldn't identify anymore, letters from friends who died decades ago, a jewelry box that played a song I didn't recognize when you wound it up. And then, buried in the back corner under a pile of old quilts, we found this ancient cookbook. The thing was falling apart, pages yellow with age, binding held together with what looked like medical tape. Mrs. Edna picked it up and smiled, said it had been her mother's, then her grandmother's before that. She was about to put it in the donation pile when something fell out from between the pages, a small, yellowed envelope that looked like it had been pressed flat for decades. And that's when everything in my boring, predictable life took a hard left turn into crazy town. Right now, I was just a guy helping his elderly neighbor clean out her attic, with no idea that I was about to stumble onto something that would change everything. Sometimes the biggest moments in your life start with the smallest act of kindness, and sometimes doing the right thing is exactly what gets you into the most trouble. So there I was, staring at this ancient envelope that had just fallen out of Mrs. Edna's grandmother's cookbook like something out of a movie. The thing looked older than dirt, that particular shade of yellow that only comes from decades of being forgotten in dark places. Mrs. Edna picked it up with the kind of careful reverence you'd use for a butterfly wing. Her hands were shaking slightly, whether from age or excitement, I couldn't tell. She opened it slowly, like she was afraid it might crumble at her touch. Inside was what looked like an old ticket stub. But this wasn't some movie theater ticket or concert stub. This thing was fancy. Heavy paper stock, the kind they don't make anymore. It had this elaborate border design, and what looked like a company logo at the top. The text was partially faded, but I could make out a name, Thomas Mulligan. And then I saw the words that made my stomach do a complete flip, RMS Titanic. April 10th, 1912. Third class. Price, £7.5. I'm not going to lie. My first thought was that this had to be some kind of replica or souvenir. You know how tourist shops sell fake historical documents? I figured maybe Mrs. Edna's family had visited some museum back in the day and bought this as a keepsake. But something about it felt different. The paper had that authentic age texture, and the ink looked like it had been applied with one of those old fountain pens. Plus, the edges were worn in a way that suggested decades of careful handling, not mass production. Mrs. Edna was studying it with a strange expression on her face. Not surprise, exactly, but more like recognition. Like she'd been expecting to find it eventually. I asked her about it, trying to keep my voice casual even though my heart was racing. She looked at me for a long moment, then back at the ticket, then back at me again. She told me the story as much as she knew it. Thomas Mulligan had been her great-grandfather, a young Irish immigrant who'd saved up for months to buy passage to America. He was supposed aboard the Titanic in Southampton, but at the last minute, he'd gotten sick, some kind of stomach flu that kept him bedridden for days. By the time he recovered, the ship had already sailed. He was devastated. Of course. Lost his savings. Had to wait months to book passage on another ship. But then the news came about what had happened to the Titanic. And suddenly his illness seemed like the luckiest break of his life. He'd kept the ticket all these years as a reminder of how close he'd come to disaster. It had been passed down through the family, stored away in that cookbook like some kind of talisman. Mrs. Edna handed it back to me with a smile that I couldn't quite read. She said I should keep it, that if it found its way to me, maybe it was meant to be mine. I tried to protest, but she was having none of it. She said she was too old to worry about preserving family heirlooms, and besides, I was the only person who'd shown any interest in her or her family's history. Her own kids and grandkids had made it pretty clear they weren't interested in a bunch of old junk. I have to admit, the whole thing felt surreal. I mean, here I was, holding what might be a genuine artifact from one of the most famous disasters in history. But at the same time, it felt almost too good to be true. Things like this don't just happen to regular people like me. When I got home that night, I couldn't stop staring at the ticket. I laid it out on my desk under my lamp and examined every inch of it. The White Star Line logo looked authentic, down to the smallest details. The serial number was hand-stamped, and the date was written in that old-fashioned style that you don't see anymore. I spent hours on the internet, looking up everything I could find about Titanic tickets. Turns out, original tickets are incredibly rare. Most went down with the ship, obviously. The few that survived were mostly from passengers who'd changed their plans last minute, or from crew members who'd kept them as souvenirs. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that this might actually be the real deal. But I also knew that without proper authentication, it was basically worthless. There are tons of fakes out there, and even experts can have trouble telling the difference. My parents' reaction was exactly what you'd expect. My mom immediately assumed it was fake and started lecturing me about how I was getting my hopes up over nothing. My dad was more interested in the potential value. He kept asking if I'd looked into getting it appraised. But honestly, I wasn't even thinking about money at that point. I was just fascinated by the history of it all. The idea that this little piece of paper represented someone's entire life plan, someone's dreams of a new beginning in America. I kept thinking about Thomas Mulligan, lying sick in his bed while the ship of his dreams sailed away without him. How devastated he must have been, how much he must have felt like a failure, and then how grateful he must have been when the news came about what had happened. The next few days were torture. I couldn't focus on anything else. I'd be at work, trying to help some customer pick out a laptop, and my mind would wander to that ticket sitting in my desk drawer. I started carrying it with me everywhere, tucked safely in my wallet like some kind of lucky charm. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to take it to the local historical society, just to get a professional opinion. I figured they'd take one look at it and tell me it was a clever fake, and then I could move on with my life. The Historical Society was housed in this old Victorian mansion downtown that had been converted into a museum, the kind of place that smells like old books and floor polish, where the volunteers are all retirees who know way too much about local history. I walked in during their lunch break, feeling like a complete amateur. The lady at the front desk looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. And when I explained what I had, she gave me the kind of look you'd give someone claiming they found Bigfoot. She called over one of their historians, a guy named Dr. Patterson, who looked like he'd stepped out of a 1950s college textbook. Tweed jacket, wire-rimmed glasses, the whole 9 yards. He examined the ticket with the kind of casual interest you'd show a child's drawing. His first comment was about how many reproductions they see, especially around the anniversary of the sinking. He said eBay was flooded with fake Titanic memorabilia, and most people had no idea how to spot the differences. But then he got his magnifying glass out and started looking more closely. His expression changed from polite skepticism to genuine interest. He asked me to wait while he made a phone call. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in a back room with two other experts, watching them examine my ticket under special lighting. They were using terms I didn't understand, pointing out details I'd never noticed. The paper composition, the ink chemistry, the printing techniques. And then came the moment that changed everything. Dr. Patterson looked up from his microscope and asked me the question that made my blood run cold. Where exactly had I gotten this ticket, and could I prove it was legally mine? Suddenly, all the excitement drained out of the room. I realized I was no longer just a curious guy with an interesting find. I was potentially someone in possession of a valuable historical artifact with a questionable chain of ownership. I explained about Mrs. Edna, about cleaning out her attic, about how she'd given it to me. But even as I was talking, I could see the concern in their eyes. They were thinking about liability, about legal complications, about the kind of headlines that museums hate to see. They told me they'd need to do more extensive testing. But based on their preliminary examination, there was a good chance this was authentic. A very good chance. And if it was authentic, it was potentially worth more money than I'd ever seen in my life. I walked out of that museum feeling like I just swallowed a live grenade. What had started as a simple act of kindness, helping an old lady clean her attic, had suddenly become something much more complicated. I had what might be a priceless artifact, but I had no idea what to do with it. The drive home was a blur. I kept thinking about Mrs. Edna, about how casually she'd handed me that ticket. Did she know what it was worth? Did she realize what she was giving away? And more importantly, would anyone believe that she'd given it to me freely? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. What if Mrs. Edna's family found out? What if they accused me of taking advantage of an elderly woman? What if I ended up in legal trouble over something that had started as a simple favor? I had no idea that within a week, all of those fears would come true in ways I never could have imagined. Sometimes finding treasure is the easy part. Keeping it is where things get really complicated. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. You know that feeling when you realize your life has just taken a complete 180, and you're not sure if you're heading toward a cliff or a pot of gold. That was me, staring at my ceiling at 6 a.m, wondering what the hell I'd got myself into. Dr. Patterson called me around 9, which was way too early for the kind of conversation we were about to have. He asked if I could come back in, said they'd finished their preliminary tests, and wanted to discuss the results. The tone in his voice told me everything I needed to know. This was big. I grabbed a quick shower and drove back to the Historical Society, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The morning commute looked the same as always. Same traffic, same strip malls, same fast food joints. But everything felt different, like I was seeing it all through new eyes. When I walked into that back room, there were twice as many people as before. Dr. Patterson introduced me to some expert from the State University, a woman from the Maritime Museum 2 hours away, and a guy who apparently specialized in paper authentication from the 1900s. They had my ticket laid out under what looked like a microscope from NASA, surrounded by charts and reference materials. The whole setup made me feel like I was in some kind of crime lab, which, given how things would turn out, wasn't that far from the truth. Dr. Patterson didn't waste time with small talk. He told me straight up that their tests confirmed what they'd suspected. This was absolutely, without question, an authentic Titanic ticket. Not a reproduction, not a souvenir, but an actual piece of history that had somehow survived over a century. The paper expert jumped in with details that made my head spin. The chemical composition matched samples from other White Star Line documents. The ink was period-appropriate iron gall ink that hadn't been manufactured the same way since the 1920s. Even the printing technique matched the methods used by the company's official printers. But here's the part that really got my attention: the serial number. Turns out they keep records of this stuff. Thomas Mulligan's ticket was logged in the White Star Line's passenger manifest, marked as in use when the ship sailed. The fact that it had survived all these years was basically a miracle. The maritime experts started talking about rarity, about how few authentic Titanic artifacts exist in private hands. She mentioned something about there being maybe 5 or 6 legitimate tickets in existence worldwide, and most of those were museums or private collections worth millions. And then came the number that changed everything. Dr. Patterson cleared his throat and said the words that I'll never forget, based on recent auction results for similar items. And considering the provenance and condition, this ticket was worth somewhere between $950,000 to $1 million. I'm pretty sure I stopped breathing for a solid 30 seconds. $1 million. For a piece of paper that had been sitting in a cookbook in Mrs. Edna's attic for decades. I kept waiting for someone to tell me they were joking, but they all had these serious expressions like they were discussing someone's medical diagnosis. My first coherent thought was about Mrs. Edna. She'd given this to me without hesitation, told me to keep it like it was just another piece of family junk. Did she have any idea what she was giving away? And more importantly, what would people think when they found out? The university experts started talking about authentication processes, about how they'd need to document everything for insurance purposes and potential sale. She mentioned auction houses, private collectors, and the kind of legal paperwork that makes your head spin. But then Dr. Patterson brought the elephant in the room, the question of legal ownership. He explained that with artifacts of this value, especially ones with complex family histories, there could be complications. Relatives might surface, claiming they never gave permission for the item to be given away. I told them about Mrs. Edna, about how she specifically said I should keep it. But even as I was talking, I could see the concern in their eyes. They were thinking about liability, about the kind of legal mess that museums and auction houses try to avoid. The maritime expert asked if I had any documentation of the gift, receipts, letters, anything that could prove Mrs. Edna had given me the ticket voluntarily. I didn't, of course. It had been such a casual moment. Neither of us had thought about legal implications. She suggested I might want to get something in writing from Mrs. Edna, maybe have it notarized, just to protect myself. She'd seen too many cases where family members came out of the woodwork when valuable items were discovered. I left that meeting feeling like I was walking around with a nuclear bomb in my pocket. The ticket was safely stored in a museum-quality protective sleeve, but I kept touching my wallet to make sure it was still there. The drive home was surreal. I kept looking at other cars, at people walking down the street, thinking about how none of them had any idea what was happening in my life. Yesterday, I was just some guy who worked at Best Buy and helped his elderly neighbor. Today, I was potentially worth more than my parents' house. I called Mrs. Edna from my car, asked if I could come over and talk to her about the ticket. She sounded pleased to hear from me, said she'd put some coffee on. I wondered if she'd be as happy to see me after our conversation. When I got to her house, she was sitting on her porch swing, same as always. She looked so small and fragile, and I felt like a complete jerk for what I was about to tell her. How do you explain to someone that they just gave away a fortune? I sat down next to her and tried to figure out how to start. Finally, I just came out with it. Told her about the museum, about the experts, about what they'd said the ticket was worth. I watched her face carefully, waiting for shock or regret or anger. Instead, she just smiled. That same peaceful smile she'd had when she gave me the ticket in the first place. She said she'd always suspected it might be valuable, but she'd never cared enough to find out for sure. She told me about her great-grandfather's story again, about how he kept the ticket as a reminder of his luck. She said luck was meant to be shared, not hoarded. If the ticket had found its way to me, then maybe it was meant to bring me the same kind of good fortune. I tried to give it back to her, or at least offer to split whatever it was worth, but she wouldn't hear of it. She said she was too old to worry about money, and besides, I was the only person who'd ever shown any real interest in her or her family's history. She did agree to write a letter stating that she'd given me the ticket voluntarily, and we had it notarized at the bank the next day. I thought that would be the end of it, that I could move forward with the authentication process and maybe eventually sell the thing. I had no idea that within a week, that letter would be the only thing standing between me and a jail cell. Because apparently no good deed goes unpunished, and when you're dealing with that kind of money, everyone suddenly becomes an expert on what's right and wrong. The first sign of trouble came 3 days later. I was at work, helping some teenager pick out a gaming laptop, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a voice told me he was calling from a law firm downtown. He said he represented certain interested parties regarding a valuable artifact that had allegedly been obtained under questionable circumstances. He suggested I might want to consult with an attorney before taking any further action with the item in question. I hung up feeling like I'd just been punched in the stomach. Somehow, word had gotten out about the ticket, and now people were circling like sharks. I realized that finding treasure might be the easy part. Keeping was going to be a whole different kind of challenge. That night, I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything. I kept thinking about how this whole situation had started with me just trying to help an elderly neighbor. Now, I was potentially facing some kind of legal battle over something that had been freely given to me. I called Dr. Patterson, told him about the phone call. He sounded concerned but not surprised. He said this kind of thing happened more often than people realized, especially when valuable items were involved. Family members who'd been absent for years suddenly developed an interest in their relatives' possessions. He recommended I get a lawyer, someone who specialized in property law and estate issues. He said the authentication process would have to be put on hold until any legal questions were resolved. As I hung up the phone, I realized my life had just taken another sharp turn. What started as a simple act of kindness was about to become a legal nightmare that would test everything I thought I knew about right and wrong. The lawsuit hit me like a freight train exactly 1 week after that phone call. I was eating cereal in my pajamas, scrolling through my phone like any other Tuesday morning when the doorbell rang. My mom answered it, and I heard her talking to someone in that overly polite voice she uses when she's uncomfortable. She called my name, and I came downstairs to find some guy in a cheap suit holding an official-looking folder. He asked if I was me, handed me the papers, and walked away without another word. Process servers don't waste time on pleasantries, apparently. The lawsuit was filed by something called the Mulligan Family Trust, representing the heirs of Thomas Mulligan. According to the papers, I was being sued for fraud, elder abuse, and illegal possession of a historical artifact. They were seeking return of the ticket plus damages for emotional distress and legal fees. The whole thing read like something out of a legal thriller. They claimed I had manipulated Mrs. Edna into giving me the ticket, taking advantage of her advanced age and deteriorating mental state. They said I had specifically targeted her because I knew about the ticket's existence and value. The worst part was how they described me, like I was some kind of con artist who preyed on elderly people. They painted a picture of me as a calculating sociopath who had spent months grooming Mrs. Edna for this exact moment. My parents' reaction was exactly what you'd expect. My mom immediately went into panic mode, convinced I was going to end up in prison. My dad started calculating the potential financial damage, talking about how this could destroy our family's reputation and finances. I called a lawyer Dr. Patterson had recommended, a woman named Sarah Chun who specialized in estate disputes. Her office was in one of those glass towers downtown that makes you feel poor just walking through the lobby. The consultation fee alone was more than I made in a week at Best Buy. She read through the lawsuit with the kind of clinical detachment that probably cost $300 an hour. When she finished, she looked at me over her glasses and asked a question that would haunt me for months. Could I prove that Mrs. Edna had given me the ticket voluntarily? I told her about the letter Weed had notarized, about how clear Mrs. Edna had been about wanting me to keep it. But Chun explained that when you're dealing with elderly people and valuable items, the burden of proof is incredibly high. The other side would argue that anyone could coerce an old woman into signing a letter. The real problem, she explained, was the missing family. The Mulligan heirs had hired a team of lawyers who specialized in exactly this kind of case. They had experts who would testify about Mrs. Edna's mental state, about how easy it was to manipulate elderly people, about the suspicious timing of the discovery. Chun told me that cases like this often came down to perception more than facts. A jury would see a young guy who'd stumbled onto $1 million artifact and an elderly woman who'd given it away for free. Even if everything was legal, it would be hard to convince people that the situation wasn't somehow unfair. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks away. Chin said We needed to build a case that showed my relationship with Mrs. Edna was genuine, that I had a history of helping her without expecting anything in return. I spent the next few days gathering evidence of my relationship with Mrs. Edna, photos of me working in her yard, receipts for supplies I bought for her house repairs, even a few text messages where she thanked me for helping her with various things. But the more I looked at it, the more I realized how little documentation I had. Most of what I'd done for Mrs. Edna was just casual neighborly stuff. No contracts, no formal agreements, no paper trail. When you're doing something out of kindness, you don't think about creating legal evidence. The other side was busy too. They'd hired a private investigator who was interviewing everyone in the neighborhood, looking for any evidence that I'd been planning this somehow. They were also preparing to have Mrs. Edna examined by a geriatric psychiatrist to determine her mental competency. Mrs. Edna was taking the whole thing better than I was. When I went to tell her about the lawsuit, she just shook her head and said she'd been expecting something like this. She told me that her family had been circling like vultures for years, waiting for her to die so they could claim whatever she'd left behind. She said the irony was that these same relatives had never shown any interest in her or her family history when she was alive. Now that there was money involved, suddenly they cared about preserving the family legacy. She agreed to testify on my behalf, but she warned me that putting an elderly woman on the stand was risky. The other side would try to make her look confused or manipulated, and juries tend to be protective of elderly witnesses. The hearing was held in one of those sterile courtrooms that smells like floor wax and broken dreams. I sat next to Chin at the defendant's table, trying to look innocent while the other side's lawyer made me sound like a criminal mastermind. Their argument was simple but effective. I had systematically gained Mrs. Edna's trust over months, then manipulated her into giving me a valuable artifact that rightfully belonged to her family. They had witnesses who would testify that I had specifically asked about items in her attic, that I had pressured her to let me help clean it out. The prosecutor was this sharp-dressed woman who made everything sound sinister. She described how I had isolated Mrs. Edna from her family, how I had taken advantage of her loneliness and confusion. According to her, I was facing up to 3 years in prison for elder abuse and fraud. When it was our turn, Chun presented the evidence of my relationship with Mrs. Edna. She showed photos of me working in her yard, receipts for supplies, testimony from neighbors who had seen me helping her over the years. She painted a picture of a young man who had genuinely cared about an elderly neighbor, but I could see the skepticism in the judge's eyes. The whole situation looked suspicious, even to me. Young guy helps elderly woman. Happens to find $1 million artifact. Elderly woman gives it to him for free. It was a kind of story that made people wonder what was really going on. The turning point came when Chun produced something I hadn't even known existed. A letter Mrs. Edna had written to her friend 6 months earlier. In it, she had specifically mentioned me as the only person who had shown her any kindness, and said she hoped she could find some way to repay me for all my help. The letter was dated months before we'd found the ticket, which proved that Mrs. Edna's gratitude toward me wasn't connected to the discovery. It showed that she had been thinking about ways to thank me long before either of us knew about the ticket's existence. Chin also presented testimony from Mrs. Edna's social worker, who confirmed that she was mentally competent and had been very clear about her intentions. The social worker said Mrs. Edna had specifically mentioned wanting to give me something meaningful as a thank you for all my help. But the most damaging evidence for the other side was a video from Mrs. Edna's doorbell camera. It showed several instances over the past year where her family members had come to her door, and she had refused to let them in. The audio was clear enough to hear her telling them to leave her alone. The final piece of evidence was something Chin had dug up in the court records, a restraining order Mrs. Edna had filed against one of her nephews 2 years earlier. Apparently, he had been pressuring her to sell her house and move to a nursing home so he could access her savings. When all the evidence was presented, the judge made his decision. He ruled that there was no evidence of fraud or manipulation, that Mrs. Edna had been competent when she gave me the ticket, and that I had a documented history of helping her without expecting anything in return. The lawsuit was dismissed, and I was free to proceed with the authentication and sale of the ticket. But the experience had changed me. I realized that doing the right thing doesn't always protect you from people who want to believe the worst about you. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt like I'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. The stress of potentially going to prison for something I'd done out of kindness had been overwhelming. I kept thinking about how close I'd come to having my life destroyed by people who had never shown any interest in Mrs. Edna until money was involved. Chun told me that cases like this were becoming more common as baby boomers aged and their possessions became more valuable. She said family members who had been absent for years suddenly developed an interest in their relatives' belongings when they realized there might be money involved. The whole experience had taught me a harsh lesson about human nature. Sometimes the people who claim to care about justice and family values are the ones who are most willing to destroy someone's life for their own gain. But it had also shown me that sometimes the system works. The truth had won out, even when it seemed impossible. And I still had $1 million ticket to prove it. 6 months after the lawsuit ended, I found myself sitting in a conference room at Christie's auction house in New York City, surrounded by more money than I'd ever imagined possible. The final hammer price for Thomas Mulligan's Titanic ticket was $960,000, plus buyer's premium. After taxes and fees, I walked away with enough money to completely change my life. But before I get to all that, let me tell you about the conversation that changed everything. The one I had with Mrs. Edna right before the auction. I drove over to her house on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a folder full of paperwork and a heart full of questions. She was sitting in her usual spot on the porch swing, looking exactly the same as always. It was like the whole legal nightmare had never happened. I sat down next to her and tried to figure out how to start. Finally, I just came out with it, told her about the auction, about what the ticket was expected to sell for, about how this was going to change my entire life. I offered, once again, to split the money with her or give it back entirely. She looked at me with that same peaceful smile she'd had from the beginning. Then she said something that I'll never forget. She'd known about the ticket all along. Not just that it existed, but what it was worth. She explained that her great-grandfather had kept detailed records of his immigration story, including correspondence with relatives about the ticket's significance. The family had always known they possessed something valuable, but they'd never cared enough to pursue it. Mrs. Edna told me that she'd been carrying the secret of that ticket for decades, waiting for the right person to give it to. She said her own children had shown no interest in family history, and her grandchildren barely acknowledged her existence. She'd been hoping to find someone who would appreciate not just its value, but its story. She said she'd been watching me for months before she asked for help with the attic. She'd seen how I treated her neighbors, how I helped people without expecting anything in return. She decided that if anyone deserved to benefit from Thomas Mulligan's luck, it was someone who understood the value of kindness. I asked her why she'd never told me this before, why she let me go through all that legal trouble. She said she wanted to see if I would do the right thing, even when it was difficult. The lawsuit had been a test, and I passed. The auction itself was surreal. I watched via video link as some of the world's wealthiest collectors bid on a piece of paper that had been sitting in a cookbook for decades. The auctioneer's voice was smooth and professional as he called out numbers that represented more money than most people see in a lifetime. When the hammer finally fell, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief because I was now financially secure for the first time in my life. Sadness because I was saying goodbye to Thomas Mulligan's story, sending it off to live in some collector's private vault. But I kept the buyer's information, and 6 months later, I was pleased to learn that the ticket had been donated to the Titanic Belfast Museum. It was going to be displayed as part of their permanent collection, where thousands of people could see it and learn Thomas Mulligan's story. The first thing I did with the money was set up a trust fund for Mrs. Edna's care. I arranged for her to have a private room at the nicest assisted living facility in the area, with full medical coverage and anything else she might need. She protested at first, but I told her it was the least I could do. I also established a small foundation that helps elderly people in our community with home maintenance and companionship services. Nothing fancy, just a way to make sure other people like Mrs. Edna don't have to struggle alone. We call it the Thomas Mulligan Foundation, and it's funded entirely by the auction proceeds. The rest of the money went into investments in a house. Nothing crazy, just a nice place in a good neighborhood where I could build a life. I quit my job at Best Buy and went back to school to study social work. Turns out helping people was something I actually wanted to do professionally. My parents' reaction to all of this was complicated. They were proud of the money, obviously, but they also had to admit they'd been wrong about helping Mrs. Edna. My mom actually apologized, which was about as rare as finding a Titanic ticket in someone's attic. My dad took a more practical approach. He started telling people about how he'd always known I was destined for great things, conveniently forgetting all the lectures about wasting time on elderly neighbors. But that's parents for you. They rewrite history to fit their narrative. The neighborhood changed too. Suddenly, everyone remembered how they'd always thought I was such a nice young man. People who'd barely spoken to me before were now asking for advice about their own elderly relatives. It was amazing how money could change people's perception of your character. Mrs. Edna lived for another year after the auction. I visited her at the assisted living facility every week, and we'd sit in the garden talking about everything and nothing. She seemed happier than I'd ever seen her, surrounded by people her own age and getting the medical attention she needed. She told me stories about her family, about growing up during the Depression, about what it was like to be a woman in the 1950s. I realized that in all the months I'd been helping her, I'd never really taken the time to learn about her life. The money had given us both something more valuable than wealth. It had given us time together. She passed away peacefully in her sleep on a Tuesday morning in March. I was one of only 3 people at her funeral, along with her social worker and a nurse from the facility. Her family members were notably absent, which somehow felt appropriate. At the funeral, I gave a short speech about how Mrs. Edna had taught me that true wealth wasn't about money, but about the connections we make with other people. I talked about how she'd chosen to share her family's luck with someone who needed it, and how that act of generosity had changed both our lives. I kept a copy of the ticket for myself, not the original, but a high-quality reproduction that the museum had made. It sits framed on my desk, not because of what it's worth, but because it reminds me of the lesson Mrs. Edna taught me about recognizing real treasure when you see it. Sometimes people ask me if I feel guilty about getting so much money for so little work. The answer is no, because I understand now that I wasn't being rude.